All that blood. What, an eagle?
Slaves, cotton and molasses, you said. Slaves bleed. All that black blood to fill a purse, sir.
The War of 1812, a unit you've probably never heard of, and a group of men whose story deserves to be remembered both in Britain and in America.
Now, don't worry, the images in this video haven't been created by Google's new Gemini AI service. This is a fascinating story about a unit that actually existed and deserves to be remembered and celebrated.
The Corps of Colonial Marines, escaped black American slaves who ran away to join the British military during the War of 1812. The unit was something of a force multiplier, men who knew these battlefields well. They were highly motivated, and the fact that they were even fighting for the British instilled fear in the Americans, who were very worried about a slave revolt behind the lines. And not only were they an important part of the British war effort, but their descendants still make up a unique ethnic group in the West Indies today. And stay tuned till the end of this episode to find out how some of the survivors of this unit continued to fight against the Americans even when the war was over, underneath the Union flag. Okay, let's crack on with today's interview. Author Matt Taylor has been researching the Corps of Colonial Marines for a long time. There's a link to his book in the description below. But I started off by asking him to explain what the War of 1812 was actually all about.
In my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinion, it was essentially an imperial war by the United States. It was an expansionist attempt to capture land, what we now call parts of Canada, with the intent of kicking British influence out of North America. And that would remove a major limit on the Americans' ability to expand across the continent. Internally, the Americans sold the reasons for this as being, well, they were very confected. There were real events, but they were turned into like a political anger machine to justify the war. Impressment of American sailors. There's the economic effect of British embargoes caused by the much bigger Napoleonic War going on in Europe. But this was all, I say, very confected. The US was unprepared for this war because it wasn't a national project. It was a partisan one. A faction within Congress and within American political life was expansionist and wasn't fully supported by everyone, but they had the numbers in Congress. They pushed through a vote for war, and then the wheel just turned. The political wheel just turned, and they were set on a course for war that they were unprepared for and didn't have the numbers for, and that meant their initial pushes into Canada all failures. Yeah, they had the classic idea that, you know, these people welcome us as liberators. Didn't happen that way. I think the Americans imagined that they'd be able to score some quick victories, knock the presence of the British government out of Canada, and we'd sign that away because we've got a much bigger, scarier war to deal with. As it turned out, that wasn't going to be the case.
And am I right in thinking that a lot of the fighting, particularly in those early engagements, was done by small local militias raised locally in Canada and so forth, and they dealt with a lot of the fighting against those early American attacks?
That's right. I mean, it's actually kind of, you know, I'm going to use a very unusual form of words here. In Canadian nationalism, this is very important because the resistance to the American invasion was largely made up not of professional soldiers. There was only a tiny number of professional British military in the two Canadian provinces that were our colonies then. It was local militias. It was allied Native Americans who had their own reasons to fear being left alone on the same continent as the United States. There was also a bit of foreshadowing. There was also free black people who'd escaped America by various means, including descendants of those who left in the American Revolution, and of course, lots of Canadians were proudly descended from loyalist Americans who left. So yeah, it was a very unique kind of melting pot moment, which created. One historian kind of referred to it as this was a crucible that created the Canadian idea of North American freedom. It's different from America. It's not America.
Yeah. Well, this leads us on nicely because your new book, Black Redcoats, is about formerly enslaved Americans who fought for the British during this war. Can you tell us, how did that come about? How did these formerly enslaved Black Americans end up fighting for the British? What were the units that were formed?
initially, there was no strong British strategy involving enslaved Americans at all. There was indeed barely a strategy. The Canadian governor's plan was to hold several fortifications and wait for a negotiated end. And because we had the war in Europe going on, the British, we fell back on what we were good at. We had naval dominance. So we said in London, they said what we can do is we can put together a fleet. We can blockade the Americans, cause even more economic harm to them. And we were aware it was a partisan war. So we imagined that if we could just turn the screws enough, the Americans, the government would collapse. The president would be deposed, or there'd be an election or something, and we could essentially get out of this war. Well, that didn't really happen. But one of the side effects of this plan was we thought we could put a fleet into the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay in North America, which is like mainly Maryland and Virginia look out to, is a huge inland sea. So if we put a fleet into that, you've got an almost infinite number of target areas all the way around. It's a relatively sheltered bay away from the main ocean, so we could keep a fleet there long term as long as we could keep it supplied. So we sent a fleet in early 1813. What happened initially was our landing operations didn't have massive success. You could only operate in a very narrow littoral area before we fall into the same traps of the American War of Independence. We don't know the ground. The Americans know it better. And also, quite importantly, America is at this point very culturally similar to the United Kingdom, and it speaks English as its main language. It's the perfect place for an impressed Royal Navy man to desert into or British Army person to desert into. So we were kind of trapped in this. We were hitting the coast, but we couldn't push any further in. But, and this wasn't part of the original plan. Out of nowhere, virtually instantly, I think the first British ships arrived in February 1813 in the Chesapeake, and I found the first recorded African-American slaves who escaped from slavery turned up in a little boat at HMS Victorious the beginning of March 1813. And what these African-Americans did, they were probably reacting to an oral memory within African-American history of all those who escaped in the War of Independence, and there was also, again, it all gets mixed up with almost quasi-religious concepts of Christ the King across the water and freedom being away from here, freedom elsewhere. So people took their chance and they came to these British ships, but many young men, almost entirely young men, said, I know where on my master's plantation, I know where he's hiding the good food. I know what he's done with the cattle and the resources that you need to keep this fleet in place. And no one knows a countryside like an escaped slave. So I can guide British forces in landing operations to operations in ways that would confound and completely mess up the Americans' ability to resist. And that happened again almost instantly. All British memoirs of this period say that overnight the effectiveness of British operations was sudden and massive. As alongside these young men directly helping British forces, they're being pilots, because lots of African-American slaves were fishermen who would go out in the bay, so they knew the bay very well. So you had ship pilots taking you to places where you couldn't go if you didn't know, as well as men helping out on land. The nearness of the British fleet meant that we also got a large influx of women and children and significantly older people escaping slavery. I mean, it's a common refrain in slave societies that women and children don't run, and that that's the lie that they tell themselves is that it's because they're more compliant. It's because trying to run hundreds of miles with kids in tow, with slave patrols and dogs coming after you, isn't worth it. If you just have to make it down to the coast and out to a ship that's literally in sight, it's a lot better. So before we knew it, we had hundreds, and by late 1813, potentially thousands of people just coming and coming and coming. The admiral in charge at that time was a guy called Admiral Warren. He had a bit of back and forth with London about what do we do? How do we formalize this situation? And it's one of these things where we're lucky there was such a long gap between the communications, because London's strategy was very, very limited. Letter of the law, very tight. It was, okay, you've got lots of escaped African Americans coming. Number one, do not induce a general slave uprising. Anything that comes to us, we have to maintain within our control and in pursuit of British policy. There was also kind of a cultural thing about how it was generally assumed that slave uprisings were incredibly bloody, barbaric events, mainly because of the Haitian Revolution. So the British didn't want to be seen as the starter of such an uprising. Otherwise, we'd lose face in Europe. We'd be encouraging a savage uprising. It'd be terrible. So no general uprising, and only people who provide a service can be offered freedom. So people who come and help us take ships in close to the coast, people who guide us on land, only offer them freedom where possible. Try and get them to sign up to the pre-existing black British units like the West Indies regiments, and free. And this is by far my favorite one. My favorite is remember, every single person the British military frees, the British government has an obligation to look after, which has a cost on the public purse. So don't get too many in, because it'll cost a lot of money, which is delightfully bureaucratic, and really makes modern British politics me go, same old. But literally, by the time this very limited authorization arrived in the Chesapeake, the situation had moved far beyond that. There was tons of non-combatants, and in the end, the admiral who became in charge of the operation after Warren, Admiral Cochrane, he issued a general proclamation called Cochrane's Proclamation, which was anyone, and he very deliberately avoided using the word enslaved or black or whatever. He just said anyone who lives in the United States who comes to us to help or not help, you just have to come to us. You can join our forces if you want, or whatever happens, we'll take you away and we'll give you freedom, land, and encouragement in some other part of the British Empire, which a massively expansive offer. And there was handbills secretly taken in by African Americans, went back secretly to their plantations to spread this message. But in the end, it was the Americans themselves who did it for us, because they reported on this in all their newspapers with outrage. And again, it's this classic thing where in a slave society, the slave owners are always surprised that slaves know stuff. And it's like they're literally serving you dinner while you're complaining about what you've read in the newspaper. The information gets out there, if you see what I mean. I'd say that meant the flood of people just sped up at that point. Again, hundreds and thousands of people over a very tight time period just fled and took their chance.
So at what point then did these people who had fled, were they formed into some sort of formal military unit, which obviously we now know as the Colonial Marines? How did that come about?
Well, I say the numbers kept on building up, and what the British fleet had done is there's an island in Chesapeake Bay called Tangier Island, which was nice and small and quite relatively distant from all the other coasts. So we took that over and built a fort on it called Fort Albion, named after HMS Albion, which was the flagship. And we were collecting people there, these black refugees as they would become known. And as and when, again, it was very much dictated by our military needs. When ships went back to Halifax in Nova Scotia or out to Bermuda, some numbers of the people there would be taken back and then onto freedom. But there was a consistent hardcore of people who wanted to fight, and who can blame them. So after that first year of 1813, and we had the long quiet winter period, it was decided that let's formalize this, because it can only aid us more. So on the 18th of May 1814 on Tangier Island, 38 young men were formed into what became the first company of the Colonial Marines. And the idea behind this was quite simple. The irregular African-American help was bringing so many advantages. We just wanted to multiply that even more. And we escalate the advantage of having people who know the ground by having a unified unit. They can all be massed in, so we can pick, who knows this area, who knows that area. in you come. But also by making it a coherent, uniformed part of the British forces, it was calculated as a propaganda and psychological warfare advantage against the Americans and a driver of further escapes. And this is where the Red Coat is central to this. From the very beginning of the unit, Admiral Cochrane wrote that it was essential that red coats be found for all the men to give them a spirit de corps and to appeal to others. And again, you read through some of we have very little primary sources from the men themselves, but we have lots of observation from their enemies, the Americans and the British. For young men who'd often toiled in rags in fields, this was a massive change. You went from being a slave, and like most African-American men throughout most of their lives be referred to as boys in like the racist language of the time. They went from that to soldiers, Marines, men with uniforms, weapons, pay, and food and drink of much greater variety, including alcohol. Again, alcohol was something that was often denied. I'm sure you'll appreciate that. This is the red coat as a symbol of liberation, not conquest or oppression, as it is many other times in history. In this instance, the red coat turned enslaved men to free men, and that's it just had this massive effect. Armed red-coated men walking onto plantations were they were a living embodiment of the promise we put out as part of our war against America, that you come to us, this happens, you become, and this again becomes quite important, you become a British man, not just a free man. You translate to freedom within the context of Britishness, and that's a very strong message to give to enslaved people anywhere.
Did these men receive any sort of training? Do we know how they were officered, what sort of weapons they were allocated? Have you come across that information?
I have indeed, yeah. It seems that in general, it took roughly a month from a Colonial Marine signing up to their first combat experience. And from what I gather, again, we don't have solid things to work off. I'm working off like one lines in the middle of huge huge like letters from officers here. Yeah, it looks like they had pretty consistent day by day drill and work with quite a lot of one-on-one time, not just with Royal Marine officers. Generally speaking, it was Royal Marine officers from the expeditionary force were just pulled out of the battalion of Royal Marines there and put in charge of the Colonial Marines, but also individual Royal Marines themselves would help and work everybody up. The senior officers, as I say, were mainly from the Royal Marines, but there was also at least one West Indies Regiment officer who he was originally meant to come and try and talk them all into the West Indies Regiment. That just didn't happen. Patton Bree was also there, and within the African-Americans themselves, several men were promoted to corporal and sergeant. The sergeant had their own sections to deal with. So within the unit as well, it's not just white officers leading black men. It's finding talented, skilled men. I mean, one good example of this is there was a chap called Sergeant Johnson. I'm afraid I couldn't find his first name, but Sergeant Johnson was an enslaved African-American. He fled, joined British forces, was recognized as incredibly talented, and became a sergeant. And in the letters of Vice Admiral Coburn, who was like their on-site commander, he's the only NCO, white or black, referred to as his friend, and he writes really movingly about what a great guy he was. And wow, as an example of the kind of risks that the Colonial Marines took, Sergeant Johnson eventually went undercover. He went back into American territory on his own with the intent of organizing a mass escape from his plantation, which is something that happened frequently. He was, though, unfortunately captured by the American militia, and as best I can tell, he was probably hanged. The other aspect of all this as well, and again, I so far I've told a very positive British story because I'm a British guy and I can't avoid that bias. But this is 20 years before slavery is got rid of in the British Empire itself. So there's a great level of hypocrisy here. Like Admiral Cochrane, who I mentioned earlier, was a slave owner. He had a plantation on Trinidad operating at literally the same time. With one hand, he's freeing African Americans; on the other hand, he's collecting his profits from his Caribbean plantation. This complexity does pop up over and over again in the context of the Colonial Marines. There is also an interesting observation is that hundreds of ships, Royal Navy ships, were involved in this operation over the course of the War of 1812, and that means that literally thousands of sailors and Marines had encounters and had the joy of being a liberator. And like, I mean, at one point, Admiral Coburn, he wrote to a guy who was running. He was working on Bermuda. There's a man who was working in Bermuda, and he was kind of responsible for figuring out what to do with the black refugees who were arriving on Bermuda. And he wrote like a kind of angry letter back saying, it's costing us a lot of money. We can't find anything for them to do. And, they want, they don't want to just they don't want just menial jobs. They want to get on in life. And it's really frustrating. And Coburn wrote back, you should take pride and happiness that you're bringing freedom to people. And that mindset keeps on appearing again. I read a lot of memoirs of people who'd been like teenage sailors during this war, and by the time they're writing their memoirs in the 1850s and 1860s, they're much higher ranked, and they're saying, that was when I became an abolitionist. I saw these desperate people doing wherever it took to get to our ships. I realized that the institution in general, including the British slavery in the Caribbean, it didn't have a future, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So it has this wider effect. It's very interesting.
But now that this unit is formed, now that they're at the disposal of the commanders there, how are they used, and what are some of the engagements that you've read about?
Well, the vast majority of their engagements were small-scale raids, usually at night time. They're not always, particularly after a couple of months. The British dominance of the region really begins to grow. So we're doing more audacious daytime attacks. We're going further inland and so on and so forth. But so broadly speaking, you've got two modes of employment. You've got the small scale, so they're still being used as guides, but also part of the combat force that they are leading into combat. And an interesting aspect of this, and a really, in my opinion, a really cool and kind of righteous aspect of this, is that very frequently Colonial Marines would have what I could only imagine was the sheer pleasure of leading British forces to their own plantations to raid them, take away supplies, livestock, and so on, but also liberate their own families. There's frequent. I've got frequent references to, you've got someone with a surname Peregrine, and he leads Royal Marines to a plantation, and suddenly there's 12 other Peregrines in the British lists. If you see what I mean, it must be like genuinely quite magical for them. Also, occasionally, really. Like, again, it's the kind of thing that it drips out of the writing, really intense, emotional face-offs with their former masters. For example, there was a slave owner called William Kilgore, I think it was, and British forces raid his plantation in the night. And again, because this is, in many ways, it's quite a weird war, because everyone speaks English, or nearly everyone speaks English, and we're very culturally similar. There's lots of back and forth. Like, lots of Americans would row out to the British ships and say things like, "Are you going to attack my town?" Because we're happy not to resist. If and there was lots of back and forth intercourse. But in Kilgore's case, the Colonial Marines and Royal Marines attack his plantation, and some of the Colonial Marines are former slaves of his who escaped relatively recently. And he has a fantastic face-off with a man I think called Richard, who would later take that surname. He'd be Richard Kilgore. By that, again, you get a lot of that. It's a way of connecting people to the wider family that might still be left behind. The former slave, Richard Kilgore, William Kilgore faces him off and says, "Why are you doing this? I'm not a bad master." No one ever admits to being a bad master. But I'm not a bad master. Why are you doing this to me? This is destroying my life. And Richard Kilgore, who I think was in second company by this point, he does a fantastic thing where he taps his pocket and it rattles because he's got some money in there because he's getting paid, and he says, it's nothing personal, but they're paying me. Which is like, and William Kilgore wrote a huge angry letter to an American newspaper describing this entire entire event, and how unnatural and terrifying it was, and how cruel it was of us to do this to white Americans. If you see what I mean, completely dodging the irony of of the slave saying, I'd be happy, probably want to stay here if you paid me and I was a free man.
Hi guys, so I'm just going to interrupt Matt there for 2 seconds to ask if you can support the show. It doesn't cost you anything. There's 2 ways you can do it. One is if you sign up for the monthly dispatch mailing list, which is at redcoathistory.com/newsletter. You get a free ebook all about the Battle of Isandlwana, and I'll send you a monthly or bi-weekly email just updating on what's happening with the website, with the YouTube channel, with the podcast. The second way you can support the show, which costs $5 a month, is by joining the Patreon. That's patreon.com/redcoathistory. And there I post all my videos and podcasts ahead of schedule, so you'll see them at least a week, if not 2 weeks, before they come out on YouTube. There'll also be behind the scenes photos and video and a chance to interact regularly. I reply to messages straight away on there, and I'm always available. All right, guys, let's get back to the content.
That's the small scale. And I say that's also lots of raids on there was lots of American fortifications on headlands, tiny little forts with 1 or 2 cannon, just enough to prevent you pushing up a river or whatever. Lots of nighttime raids on them. Yeah, again, usually using the knowledge of local escaped people to get round the back, use hidden paths and so on. But on the larger scale, units of maybe 50 to 100 men, a full company, they were used almost exactly the same as you would use light infantry in any Napoleonic battle. They were scouts, they were skirmishers, they were working ahead of the main force, clearing the paths, discovering things, discovering enemy concentrations and so on. And when the Colonial Marines when the Colonial Marines in the Chesapeake Bay, when they went into their one large battle, which was the Battle of Bladensburg, they were attached in the light division to all the light companies of the other British regiments involved. But man, that's again, because of their local knowledge, and also you can't get away from the fear factor that armed black men bring to Marylanders and Virginians. That's a real psyop on the American forces, because all slave societies are precarious security societies that maintain themselves by a certain level of terror on the enslaved. So the idea that now there's a third force, the United Kingdom, arming them, undermined the American ability to resist in virtually every way.
And talking of the Battle of Bladensburg, then, I didn't know much about this, but in your book, that was on the approach to Washington, wasn't it? When the British famously burned the White House.
Indeed,
and you do say how the Colonial Marines were a real force multiplier. Was that the main reason? Because they just instilled such fear in the Americans?
Very much so. I mean, the Battle of Bladensburg, it's very famous even in the United States, because it's one of the worst defeats ever suffered by American forces, and it was in front of their capital. It was meant to be. It was a larger army than the invading British army, and it just came apart. There's lots of reasons for this, and there was a lot of command confusion because there was a weirdly high number of senior government officials on the field, including the president. The American officers who originally arrived at the scene, they set up a pretty good defensive position on a hill. That was later, they were later told to pull out of that, and they were told to pull back across the river and create 3 lines which were mutually unsupporting, and they divided their significant artillery advantage between these 3 lines. So when the British arrived at the scene, we had a river and a bridge, and the Americans, they're all on the wrong side of the river, too far away. And the bridge is the obvious tactical point and strategic point. So the Light Division, which was the 4th King's Own, the 44th East Essex, the 85th Light Infantry, and the 21st Scottish Fusiliers, along with maybe 100 or more Colonial Marines, was flung at that bridge, because the experienced officers of the British force were like, we can get across that bridge and into them, it's game over. They can't hold us here like they should have had if they had a slightly better setup. The Colonial Marines and the other light units pushed across the bridge through quite murderous fire, but it was nowhere near where it should have been. I mean, if the Americans had a more competent layout, we would never have crossed that river. But they pushed across the bridge, and then swung from the British perspective, they swung right into an orchard, and that orchard ran almost right up to the first American line, which again is another very terrible tactical position.
Yeah, so they had lots of cover and concealment.
That's right, yes, and they pushed all the way up, and at that point, and again, this is where historians differ. There's the argument is that the American militia units, who are just blokes with guns who don't do this every day, they cracked under the fear of bayonets and the fear factor of Congreve rockets, the massive screaming fireworks of yore, and the army fell apart. But my argument, and it's an argument that others do have, is that at the moment of contact, when the light divisions hit the American militia line, that was when the Americans at that point would have become aware that it's not just Brits who are obviously feared as Napoleonic warfighters. It's African Americans. It's your own coming for you. And at that point, the line directly in front of the light division collapses, and the whole army unzips. It's remarkable. The whole army runs and just falls back against not a very large force. And in at least one American account, one American general, Walter Smith, who was part of the Georgetown militia, which was one of the units that folded, he said, and again, it's one of these ones which kind of disappears down the track in history terms. He said that we ran because the appearance of African Americans on the British side reminded everybody that our wives and kids are at home alone with our slaves. So if they're here and they're armed, what's happening back home? And then, quite charmingly, another American officer in his memoirs, he actually blames that on Walter Smith himself. He actually says that Walter Smith spent most of the run up to the battles talking about what a disaster a slave rebellion would be right now. And again, in terms of military life, if you're a line trooper and you hear an officer banging on about that, by the time it reaches everybody else in the army, it's already happening. If you see what I mean. So I think the American, I think that aspect of the American defeat, it was quite prevalent in all these immediately post-war memoirs by Americans, but then it's gradually dropped down the radar to it just being the Brits were scary and we weren't a professional force. But I think, again, the fear of a slave uprising happening behind you while you've got direct evidence in front of you that it can happen had a much greater effect than is perhaps generally considered.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so this was the Chesapeake Bay. Obviously, we go on, we burn down Washington. But in your book, you talk a lot about the Colonial Marines down south in Georgia. Yeah. Can you just give us a brief overview of how they ended up? Is it the same guys who then go down to fight in Georgia, or are new units recruited?
It is indeed the same guys in Georgia. After the burning of Washington D.C., I mean, again, when you think about our campaign on the American coast during the War of 1812, I find it most useful to think about it as a punitive campaign, a very Victorian style campaign. It's not designed to hold ground. It's designed to destroy things valuable to the enemy, to show them that we could do this at any time, and therefore put them off fighting us. After the destruction of Washington D.C., the enemy capital, that was our big win. We then famously, of course, had a go at Baltimore, but Baltimore had seen what had happened to DC, and in Baltimore they'd had the time to throw up massive earthworks and bring in a lot more troops who'd fled from us at Bladensburg, had got to there, and it was probed on land at sea. Famously, Fort McHenry didn't fall to our bombardment, so we pulled out. It was too tough a nut to crack. And again, the American history regards that as a great victory. It's the source of their national anthem. But in terms of the British objective, we've burnt down the capital city. Why waste our relatively limited power on a small target that's heavily defended? So the next strategy was it's time for a move down south to Georgia, and the reason for that was Southern America at this point ended at Florida. Florida is Spanish territory. Louisiana, off to the west, is only very recently American territory. And I think in theatre, this was where the idea started germinating that the United Kingdom could get a major land grab out of this. We could capture Louisiana. You know, I mean, it always things where if we captured New Orleans, you bought New Orleans off Napoleon, a well-known global criminal. So that obviously doesn't count. It's ours now. You know, something like that would have been the plan.
Yeah.
And attacking Georgia is kind of the corner that turns towards Louisiana in terms of America, because inland America is still largely undeveloped and is ruled by Native Americans. It's the coastal strips is how America communicates with itself. And when the Colonial Marines from the Chesapeake arrived in Georgia, we're looking at a vastly different scenario in a lot of different ways. Georgia operated a different kind of slavery generally. You have what you have in Virginia and Maryland. You have what is often called the gang system, where slaves are like a prison gang. They're observed at all times. They're kept on the job all day, and so on. In Georgia, you had what was often called the task system, where slaves had to do 1 or 2 things a day, which could take any amount of time, but the rest of the time they were pretty much able to live as they please and organize their lives as they please. And that was because Georgia as a whole was something like 45% enslaved. Like, of the population of the whole state, 45% were enslaved. On the coast, which was called the Rice Coast because that was its major food export, it was almost 75%. So when the British forces arrived off the coast of Georgia, instantly we get another flood. I mean, because the war came to a sudden end, British forces were only off the coast of Florida for 50 or so days, but 30 people a day came every day, some traveling miles. That was, and my argument is, but again, which is, you have to be careful with it because it's a bit of counterfactual, a bit of speculative, you know, but my argument is, when the Chesapeake Colonial Marines came down to Georgia and they based on an island called Cumberland Island, they were then joined by some West Indies regiments. This meant that the British force perched on the coast of Georgia was majority black. It was mainly white officers and commanders, but the line troops were a bunch of Royal Marines, lots of Colonial Marines, lots of West Indies regiments. And I reckon if the war went on a little longer and we'd launched an attack on, say, Savannah, the capital of Georgia, to emulate our attack on Washington, D.C., in that demographic difference, I don't think we'd have been able to prevent a general uprising from happening around our campaign. And what could have arose from that in terms of the trajectory of North American history? It's fun to think about, and remarkably interesting to think about. You know, imagine a black British protectorate, British Georgia, being carved out of it. Yeah. And again, I think also you can sense a bit of this in the Treaty of Ghent, which was the treaty between the United Kingdom and the United States to end the war, was very much a status quo antebellum treaty. You know, let's all just go back to how it was, like nothing happened. I think the American willingness to grab that as a good call, as a good deal, was partially motivated by this awareness of their own weakness. And British theatre commanders were likewise all aghast at how good this treaty was for the Americans, because I think they knew we had, particularly places like Georgia, really kind of in our sights as a place we could have taken.
And is that why you argue that the Colonial Marines were so important in Georgia, because of that psychological factor again?
Very much so. Again, you get the same deal where almost instantly on arrival off the coast of Georgia, you've got all these people fleeing to us, but you've also got white Americans fleeing inland from the inevitable slave uprising that's going to happen. And it also had a useful diversionary effect in that American Georgian troops who were meant to head west to Andrew Jackson and New Orleans were held in position in Georgia, not capable of attacking, but can't move, because even if we don't directly attack, they might be needed for civil insurrection oppression purposes, if you see what I mean. And again, the language used by the Americans in their own newspapers and in their own letters is apocalyptic. It's, you know, this is it. The savage, the Brits are going to unleash the savage Negro war we've always feared, because, of course, the only example anyone has is the Haitian Revolution, which was, although not entirely an indiscriminate massacre of white people, in common imagination, that is what happened. So any suggestion that would come to America, to the United States, was were again morale shattering for the United States.
Yeah. And I mean, one interesting part of the conflict is Florida, and you've got the Florida Colonial Marines. Can you tell us a little bit about them and how they were formed?
Oh yes, the Florida Colonial Marines are remarkably more complex and interesting. So Florida at this time, which is separated into two colonies, is nominally Spanish territory. So it's not America; it's part of the Spanish Empire. But Spain, of course, is in an incredibly weak position because it's got its own problems at home, and people that with divided loyalty between the Napoleonic regime and the dissenting royal family. So Spanish control over Florida is nominal at best, and indeed, when the British forces decided to form a base in Florida, we went to Cuba to meet the nominal military commander of the region for Spain, and he just signed it off as, whatever, don't take over any of the big towns, which kind of gave away that control outside of these small number of locations was non-existent. Because of this, it meant that what I will call for ease, the African-American population here was a lot more complex. It was both African-Americans in the sense of American-owned people who'd escaped into North Florida for freedom, but it also had large numbers of Afro-Spanish, Afro-French, and people who were enslaved by the Native American groups, who were the majority in that area. What we've got here is a much greater array of life experiences, social experiences, and importantly, political experiences. Lots of the Afro-Spanish slaves and the Afro-French slaves, they'd been through the ups and downs of the French Revolution, got rid of slavery, Napoleon brought it back. The Spanish had various juntas that had come and gone. So it was a lot more complicated, and the British incursion in this territory is building a new group of colonial marines to again expand our military power and our striking power, but we're also attempting at the same time to get on side the Native Americans of the area, the Creek and the Seminole mainly, who had their own very good reasons to dislike the United States at this time. So the nature of the situation there is the Colonial Marines are not only an adjunct force to the British invasion, they're our strongest and most aligned to our purposes force in the region, because the Native Americans, we want them on side, but they never lose their own agency and their own willingness to go their own way. And it's in one order sent to the British commander of the Florida contingent, he's reminded, you can't assume control over Native Americans. The chiefs of the Native Americans, they're in charge, and you have to get them on side. So that meant that the Colonial Marines we raised from this quite polyglot mixture of what we just African descended people in the region, they were the biggest British aligned force in a very complicated ethnic political environment, and that meant on a more practical level that when we built a fortification at Prospect Bluff which eventually became the largest man-made object in Florida outside of Spanish-controlled towns. That fort was garrisoned by Colonial Marines. It was surrounded by friendly Native American groups, and it became a quite complicated community, really. But the fort itself was held by Colonial Marines because they were directly plugged in to British aims in the region.
So one of the commanders of the Florida Marines was a fascinating Royal Marine officer called Nicholls, I believe. He comes across really well in your book, fascinating character, gives some amazing speeches. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Oh, he's a very interesting chap. I mean, Nicholls, Edward Nicholls, he was called by one historian the finest Royal Marine officer ever. In his career, he fought in 107 actions, which is an incredible number. And he seems to have been quite a wild, happy warrior type with very strong convictions. One of these convictions was anti-slavery, abolitionism, which seems to have come from his revivalist Christian faith. Like a lot of abolitionists in this period, it was an outgrowth of a revivalist Protestantism that made him strongly anti-slavery. So sending him into Florida to form a military unit from escapees from slavery and displaced and persecuted native peoples, that was a meeting of mind and matter in a very real way. He saw the task he'd been given to build a colonial marine force of mainly African people and ally with the Native Americans in explicitly crusading terms. As you mentioned, he's made a great speech, and I genuinely believe this is one of the great emancipatory speeches by a white Briton, and it's sad we don't know more about it, and I hope to push it out there. At Pensacola, which was a nominally Spanish town, but the Spanish governor invited British forces in, and so we moved into there as well. He made a speech initially to the Royal Marine contingent he had with him, because they were going to be the men who were going to train the Native Americans and train the escaped African people into a new military force. He said to them, you have to remember that they have been oppressed by cruel taskmasters, and under slavery, man's best faculties are kept dormant. And it's a wonderful and glorious thing for British soldiers to set them free. That's quite amazing in itself. But then he turns to the Colonial Marines, so the formerly enslaved people who are now being formed into a British military unit, and he says to them, you are already heroes because you've dared to be free. Together we will unrivet the chains of thousands of people like you lingering in bonds. And when peace comes, you'll have the comforts of enjoying rational liberty, which is a classic British statement from the era. You'll have the comforts of enjoying rational liberty, solid property, and the rights of British men. Never again will you see the women you love taken from you and the children of your love taken away into foreign oppression. And then, which is remarkably moving. And then right at the end, he says, above everything, be riveted to your duty, to your God, and be loyal and true to your king and country. So when peace comes, industry, plenty, and happiness will amply reward your hardships, your sufferings, and your wanderings. And it's an astonishing emancipatory speech, like piled high with humane perspectives and like quite radical concepts. You know, he not only tells his own troops that slavery is what slavery reduces men. You're not born into a natural state of servitude. People aren't naturally slaves. It's slavery itself that pushes you down, and together we're going to raise them up, and that's wonderful. But then he casts the Colonial Marines as newly forged British men, loyal to the same king and country as Nicholls himself. So he's giving them, he's saying to them, you're heroes because you dared to be free, and in being free, you've gained for yourselves the rights, privileges, and identity of being British. And that's, again, it speaks to whole arguments about the relationship between Britishness, white Britishness, as some would declare it, and people of non-white heritage. What it actually is this a corporate identity that you can become? And I'm biased, and I believe it is a corporate identity in which anyone can choose to be, if you see what I mean. But to have him just throwing that out there in the early 1810s is remarkable. And the effect, this had a genuinely powerful effect. Years later, as we'll probably talk about later on, years later, there were still former Colonial Marines in Florida, and they were communicating via British traders and British adventurers to Nicholls, or trying to, and the love and awe they had for the message he said was still very much there, if you see what I mean. So he really did create something in people's minds and hearts, which is remarkable.
Yeah, he feels like one of these historical characters who should be better remembered.
Indeed, he seems to have a single portrait, which is in the officers' mess at Royal Marine Barracks Stonehouse, which a gentleman there kindly provided me a picture of it for my book. But yeah, he definitely deserves to be significantly better known, just for being as I mentioned earlier, Admiral Cochrane, who proclaims freedom. He was a slave owner. But at the other end of the scale, you've got Nicholls, who is in many ways going way beyond, ideologically or politically speaking, anything that other British officers did. So you've got this great, you've got the full sweep. And actually, having said that, So you've got Cochrane, who you could claim was quite hypocritical because he was a slave owner who gave freedom to some. You've got Nicholls, who is an abolitionist firebrand. And in the middle, Admiral Cockburn, who I've mentioned once or twice, he literally wrote down in a letter that when I was given the job of leading Colonial Marines, I thought it was a terrible idea. You know, black people aren't going to be good soldiers. But I have revised my opinion of their whole race, having met and worked with them. So they had the full sweep of like empathic experience.
Well, look, we're sort of getting towards the end of the War of 1812, which obviously went well beyond the year of 1812 up until 1815. Were these guys heavily engaged now towards the end of the war, and were they fighting at the famous Battle of New Orleans?
No, they weren't. They didn't go to the Battle of New Orleans, and I believe the reason for that is what I mentioned earlier: is that they formed the British aligned force in our North Florida enclave. The Native Americans were allied to us, but were separate enough that in order to maintain our position in North Florida, they remained there. That didn't mean they didn't have action. They fought briefly against Andrew Jackson's forces at Pensacola. They also fought in numerous skirmishes around the edges of the territory around Prospect Bluff, where American forces would occasionally launch little raids or reconnaissance missions. One of those reconnaissance missions, intriguingly enough, included a young Davy Crockett, who was sent packing by these people. So
brilliant.
But at New Orleans themselves, Nicholls was there, as was Cochrane, but they had a much larger British force from Jamaica to work with. And I reckon just from the reading that it was like, we'll keep those guys in that position because we need a holding force, and they know the ground, and that's where they were raised.
I mean, let's focus on Florida for now. I believe even when the war ends, these guys are still ready for a scrap. They're ready to keep fighting the Americans. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's right. When they said the war suddenly ended, as you know, because it was just the British Empire had no real strategic aim, and the Americans had failed in their aim, which was to push us out of North America. So it was all over. While we pulled out of everywhere else, North Florida was still nominally Spanish territory, so we didn't have to leave. So the Colonial Marines in North Florida at Prospect Bluff, Nicholls essentially gave them the choice. He said, we can take you away, or you can remain if you wish. Though of course it's dangerous to remain because who knows what the future will hold. But at least a couple of hundred Colonial Marines definitely remained behind, and there was obviously thousands of Native Americans in the area who were aligned to them. There's a really interesting ethnogenesis going on here, like the modern Afro-Seminole, part of the Seminole Native American group are descended from these. What's the word? A lot of them decided to stay behind, and Nicholls initially he tried to get the Native American groups in the region and the free black people recognized as a British protectorate. He wrangled out of the Native American chiefs a very British friendly treaty, which more or less made it a protectorate of the British Empire and offered colonial rights, the ability to, any white man from Britain who arrives will be given land. But London didn't go for that, I think, for fear of just reigniting the war immediately. We just got out of this war. Let's not then create an issue on their border. Though the counter argument is we were in such a dominant position. If we had made it a protectorate, it's outside American control anyway. They just have to deal with it. So, it's the nature of history. But they didn't go for it. And Nicholls was upset by this, and he had some good back and forth arguments with American Indian agents about the status of the Native Americans as well as the free black people. And in the end, he left the community at Prospect Bluff with thousands of muskets, several cannon, tons of swords and ammunition. Prospect Bluff became a heavily armed agricultural community made from a synthesis of different Native American groups and the free black people, and it only existed for maybe a year or so. But in that period, a distinct culture was emerging. They celebrated Christmas, but they also had various Native American celebrations, and this wasn't like a nest of scared runaways hiding in a forest. This was a powerful modern fortification with a British trained and drilled military force thousands of people stretched over miles of agricultural communities. The militia, he had an organized militia, which was noted for having like pickets out miles away, which challenged anyone coming into the territory. The officers continued to wear their red coats. It was so successful that a Spanish garrison some miles away at one point sent an envoy to basically beg for food, because the Spanish garrison was having supply problems and this community was thriving quite distinctly. It really posed no direct threat to the United States, apart from the ideological threat of being a free, non-white, Native American, African-American culture just over the border. And people still escaped from Georgia and did the dangerous crossing into Florida to find this community. And that meant that Andrew Jackson, who was a very big believer in the racially ordered world of the United States, he saw this as a threat, whether it was or not argument, but he saw it as a threat to America. And because he was basking in his hero of New Orleans status, which would eventually make him the president, he ordered some of his subordinates to organize an incursion into Spanish territory, which would create a casus belli by a showdown with the population of that community, and then the American military would rock in and destroy it. And he was he was quite overt about it. He wrote very distinct, vague letters to some people saying, you know, on whatever ground they fight, you must fight. If it happens to be in a foreign land, doesn't matter. But then he wrote to other people, God, I hope they've got the hint that I want them to destroy this community. So he was quite overt about it in private. So the Americans sent a small naval force and a small land force, which converged on the fort. They had their casus belli. A watering party was attacked, and several of the men were killed. And so they advanced to the fort. And at the fort, the Americans parlayed with the community, and the community sent out a man called Garçon, who was a former Colonial Marine officer and had formerly been an enslaved man. And they said, you know, surrender, and we'll take you all back to the United States and take you back into slavery. And and Garçon with incredible dignity and incredible bravery, he said, I have been left as military commander of this fort by the King of Great Britain, so I can't surrender it. And the fort then run up a Union Jack and a red flag, and the red flag is a naval one, meaning no quarter. And in American history, that shows what a savage community they were. But the Americans had just came and said, return to lifelong slavery for you and all your children forever. So it was already a no quarter battle, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And so the Americans pulled back, and the Americans with Native American allies as well, they attacked the fort, and by sheer luck, a heated cannonball hit the fort's powder magazine, and there was a massive explosion which killed hundreds of people instantly. And Garçon was found alive, though blinded, by the Americans after they went after the fort was destroyed, and he accepted responsibility for the deaths of the American soldiers of the watering party, and the Americans then handed him over to their Native American allies, and the Native Americans killed him in a brutal fashion, as is common in Native American warfare. But that meant the Americans got that was hands clean, and a small number of survivors sadly did return to slavery. They were dragged back to Georgia, including one man who was actually from Virginia and came from Virginia with the Colonial Marines all the way down to Florida, presumably as maybe as a help to training, an expert and or an example. But after the destruction of this fort, the American advance had been seen coming, so a significant portion of the community had left. The fort was largely military held at this point, although there was sadly lots of women and children still. So over this battle, which is often called the Battle of Negro Fort, because in American newspapers it became the Negro Fort, because there's only one. The Negro Fort. After that battle, that was the starting gun on the American conquest of Florida. And so over the following decades, as Florida is gradually taken over by the United States, the Native American resistance to that, the Seminole Wars, in there, frequently, over and over again, there are armed, free black men, some of them still in red coats, and they're still fighting. And American agents are saying, oh, there's a man here who clearly was taught by the British and he's training other people, weapons drill and stuff. They're centers of resistance and knowledge for years to come. What's the word? I mean, and within this as well, there's an interesting further point here. Within this as well, there was official British indifference to this. This was an American issue. The Americans by this time had formally purchased Florida from Spain, so they were just imposing their control on it. So we were officially unengaged, but there was tons of gun running from the Bahamas. Native Americans came back and forth asking for help, which was one Native American chief turned up in Nassau in the Bahamas with a copy of Cochrane's proclamation, still kicking around, asking for help. And there were several British adventurers, as they were called, who, freebooters, mercenaries, with various motives, who went into Florida, some of whom were motivated by a desire to prove British loyalty and honor to people we'd been allied with, others who were just there because it's an adventure. And two of them were two gentlemen called Ambrister and Arbuthnot, and they fought alongside the Native Americans against the American invaders. And one of those two men, I think Arbuthnot off the top of my head, he had formerly been an officer in the Colonial Marines. And these two men were captured by Andrew Jackson's army, and they were court-martialed by essentially a kangaroo court of military officers. They were court-martialed of aiding an enemy, and they were executed. And this was incredibly, it caused a massive storm. There was a congressional investigation which went nowhere. Andrew Jackson had this great skill of doing quite illegal things, but getting away with it due to his popularity. So he killed two British subjects, causing a diplomatic storm, and Congress nearly censured him, but didn't at the end, if you see what I mean. So his path to presidency continued. But we talk about historical ramifications here. The group of military officers that he put together who condemned these two British soldiers to death for aiding Native Americans, they exist today as the legal precedent for the military tribunals used in Guantanamo Bay. So if you want to see like the long shadow of history, there you are. Because it was just a bunch of military officers somehow constitute themselves a court and made a judgment on people, and that's a precedent, and it's been disinterred in the 21st century.
How important, historically speaking, do you think these guys were, both for British military history, but also for American history?
Well, this is the thing. It's a big question, so I'll answer it in bits. In terms of British military history, the Colonial Marines, I believe, were a much greater factor in the War of 1812 than is commonly remembered. There might have only been 1,000 or so, or 1,500 at maximum, but this is a war of small numbers of men in a big landmass. 1,500 men could change the direction of history, and the Colonial Marines, in my opinion, in their way, they did. The campaign against the American coast was morale shattering because of Colonial Marines. In Washington, D.C., the only time the capital of the United States burnt, but has been captured by a foreigner and in our case burned, was because of the Colonial Marines. And within the British military, the Royal Marines, I think, should be louder that this is part of their history. If you're a Black Royal Marine today, in your history as a Royal Marine, your forebearer Marines liberated people in this incredibly cool way, this incredibly righteous way, and it's a really intense tale of what people can do. The African-Americans who became Colonial Marines, they weren't the passive recipients of benevolent British help or anyone's help. The Brits rocked in and we created the circumstances, but it was the enslaved people themselves who used their initiative and their bravery and their courage to grasp freedom for themselves. And like Nicholls said, they've dared to be free, and by daring to be free, they'd made themselves heroes. And I think that makes them heroes worth remembering in all of our histories.
So thanks a lot to Matt for that. That really was an amazing story. I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. Please share this episode with anybody you think will be interested. Be sure to subscribe, leave a thumbs up and a comment. Let's help British military history to continue to grow. Let's make it an area of interest that youngsters want to learn about.